Namaste to everyone. Let me welcome you all to this Mahabharat series. And as you all know, this is Indian history class number 20. So, just a small recapitulation of what we have discussed in the last class. That is Indian history class number 19. So, first a general recapitulation that for the last 5 to 6 classes, we have been discussing about the ancient India, that is the period from 600 BC to around 600 AD. So that is the 1200 years period. We call that as ancient India or early political India, whatever the name, but we are discussing the period 600 BC to 600 AD. In that, for the first 2 classes, we discussed about the polity of the period. So how from rise of Mahajanapadas by 600 BC to around the rise of Gupta Empire by 600, the decline of Gupta Empire by 600 AD. So that political history, early political history, we discussed in the first 2 classes of ancient Indian portion. After that, we started with economy of this period, 600 BC to 600 AD, the ancient Indian economy. In that, the last weekend, that is Indian history class number 19, we discussed about in the economy, we discussed about the rural economy. So the ancient rural economy is the topic that we discussed in the last class. So this is actually the last class subheadings, what we have discussed. Just a small 2 minutes recapitulation. In the starting of our last class, what we discussed? First we discussed that the countryside, the rural side of the India, ancient India, after 600 BC, there was a change. So changing countryside we have discussed. Change in what sense? For example, the relationship between the king and the subjects was strained. It was not happy. They were not happy. Why? We discussed because of the taxation. So that was the changes which were initiated in the countryside. And then we discussed about how the people, because of these changes happening in the polity and all other domains of the society, how the people were actually thinking about the kings. So that was the popular perception of the king. We discussed under this about how the people were actually responding to the changes in the polity, like introduction of the taxation. So people responding in different ways in the rural side. So some of the people are just absconding and even they are going out of the kingdom and into the deep forest to escape the taxation and all these things. And some of the people are staying there and responding to the taxation by changing the way of production of agriculture produce. So for example, they have started, responded by introducing a lot of strategies for increasing the production. We have discussed the strategies like iron plowshare technology, hoe agriculture technology, transplantation of the paddy technology. So all these strategies were adopted in the rural side to, in response to the taxation. And we also discussed because of these strategies, some of the rural section got benefited most and some others were not benefited at the same pace. So that is where the differential access to the land, differential access to the labor and differential access to the technology decided who benefited the most. So that uneven distribution of the improved technology, uneven distribution of the improved production and efficiency in agriculture led to the differences in the rural society. We discussed, so what were the differences? Within the rural side, we have 3 different types of communities grown up. For example, landless laborers and large landowners in every village, and then small peasants and small farmers. These are 3 different types of the people we discussed. And I have given one example also that in Tamil Sangam text, it mentions about 3 different communities in a typical Tamil village. They are Vellalar, who are the large landowners, and Uzavars, who are the small peasants and plowmen, and then Adimai, who are the slaves. So that is how the differences were induced in the rural society. The already differences were there from latter Vedic period itself, but they got sharpened because of the improved strategies in the agriculture and changes in the polity and economy in a sense. And then we discussed about the land grants. So the practice of land grants, we discussed why they actually started, why kings were giving land as grant to the Brahminical sections and even the religious institutions. So why the kings were giving land grants, we discussed in the last class. And because of the practice of land grant, in the rural side we have seen the rise of elites. So a new section coming up who are becoming powerful in the ladder of monarchy, we can say. So for example, Gahapatis and the village headmen, they are becoming more powerful inside the village because they own the land. That is why control of land became important. So a new elites have come up because of the land grants. We have discussed that. After that, why land grants started? I have listed out a lot of reasons. For example, extension of agriculture to uncultivated lands. Perhaps that was the reason why the kings started land grants. I explained. And the other reasons I have told, like maybe after 200 BC, after the fall of Mauryan Empire, we have seen the weakening of political power. So perhaps that was the reason when the political power was on the decline, kings always wanted to win over the Samantas and their allies. So normally they were to give land grants to them, to appease them. It is almost like an appeasement politics. We discussed that. So, and also one point that Shatavahanas were actually believed to be the pioneers of these land grants because they are Brahmins. So normally when they become rulers, the other Brahmins don't accept it because actually Brahmins believe only Kshatriyas should become the rulers. And to appease them, normally perhaps they would have adopted this land grants. Or some other reason, maybe just because they are also Brahmins, they want to help their other Brahmins by giving the land grants. So a lot of reasons for them. This is how, in conclusion, the ancient rural economy from 600 BC to 600 AD, these are the main important changes what were happening in the rural side of the ancient India. Now Indian history class number 20. So we are going to discuss today. Already we discussed about the rural economy. So now this is the second class of ancient Indian economy, and in this class we are going to discuss about the urban economy of the ancient India. So from the same period 600 BCE to around 600 AD, how the urban side of the India, urban side. So for the first time after 600 BC, we have seen the rise of Mahajanapadas. So normally cities had come up. I explained when I was explaining Mahajanapadas and the polity of the ancient India. So today we will discuss in this class the urban economy, specifically the economy from 600 BC to 600 AD. What were the changes happening when the rural side was going through these changes? What was happening in the urban side? Let us see. Yes. So yes, it is Indian history class number 20, and the topic that we are going to discuss today is ancient urban economy. Ancient urban economy, and the period that we are going to discuss is 600 BC to 600 AD. Yes, as I have explained you how the rural changes were happening in the countryside. Normally you will see some points I have explained that the strategies were changed in the way of production of agriculture. So when the strategies to produce the agricultural material got changed, normally what happens? The production increases. So when technology is induced into the society, the production would increase and also the efficiency would increase. So just imagine like this. A village was there in the ancient India. After 600 BC, it adopted a lot of technologies like as I have explained, listed out in the last class, irrigation technology, hoe agriculture, transplantation of the paddy, iron plowshare technology. So that village got adopted everything. Now just imagine over the period of time what happens. That village would produce more food grains than it was actually producing in the previous time. Yes or no? So basically the point that I wanted to tell you is when rural side was changing and adopting new technologies, new ways of agricultural production, normally the production got improves. That means from sustaining level, sustainable agriculture we will call it as, and even subsistence level. The first economy, agricultural economy, was subsistent in nature. till 600 BC. But after that, subsistence economy got changed and upgraded into commercial economy. For example, whenever you produce more grains than what you needed, what do? You will sell it to other people who are in need of them. So that means beyond your requirements, the villages and the rural side started producing the grains, started producing the food grains and all other food material, and that is called as the surplus. So when agricultural surplus was there in the society, normally it leads to trade. Yes or no? So how urban economy actually triggered, what actually it was triggered by? It was triggered by the changes in the rural economy, where it produced lot of surplus food grains, and now that food grains, and not only food grains, the surplus food grains would be exchanged with some other material who are living, which are produced by those people who are living in the urban side. So a rural urban connection got bonded up with the what? With the trade mechanism. Now, by 600 BC, what was happening in the political domain? As I have said, Mahajanapadas rose up. From latter Vedic period, Janapadas of latter Vedic period, they became Mahajanapadas of 600 BC. And when Mahajanapadas rose up, I have explained some points there when we were discussing the polity of ancient India. Every Mahajanapada was having a capital city. Yes or no? So the first feature after 600 BC is the coming up of the towns. Very important, sir. Coming up of the towns to such an extent that we call this period after 600 BC, we will call this period as the second urbanization period in India. This is the second urbanization. So what was the first urbanization period? It was the Indus Valley civilization period. That was the first urbanization in India. And after 600 BC, because of the agricultural surplus which was achieved by the rural society after 600 BC, lot of towns have come up. So towns will actually suck that agricultural surplus which was being produced in the rural side. Through which mechanism? Through trade mechanism. So understood? Now, first one was after 600 BC, we have seen the coming up of new towns. So now let us discuss about the towns. First, most of the towns, if you see most of the towns after 600 BC, they are actually the new capital cities of Mahajanapadas. So I have explained after 600 BC to till the establishment of Mauryan Empire, the first 300 years period of this ancient India, Mahajanapadas were actually rose into power. So Mahajanapadas were 16 in number, major Mahajanapadas. So every Mahajanapada was having a capital city, and that actually triggered the initiation of the towns, coming up of towns in ancient India. So the first point in towns is that most of the cities or most of the towns are, what are they? They are actually the capital cities of the Mahajanapadas. So new cities have come up because of Mahajanapadas. So Mahajanapadas rose to power, and every Mahajanapada was having a capital city, and because of that political monarchy establishment, we have seen the number of towns got increased. So the one reason was because the kings, Raja of latter Vedic period now became king after 600 BC, and the monarchy was strengthened. This is the change in political domain. And in the rural domain, what was happening? Agricultural produce got increased because of the adopted strategies, and lot of surplus has come. So agricultural surplus plus political monarchy all led to the establishment of towns, and most of the urban centers actually they are all the capital cities of the Mahajanapadas. This is the first important point. Now let me tell you the second important point about the towns. All the capital cities, sir, please listen, very important. All the capital cities of Mahajanapadas, if you see, they are situated along the lines of communication or along the routes of communication. So this is very important. Most of the towns are along routes of communication. Routes of communication. So along the routes of communication. Why? Why? Here is very interesting fact. Yes. So as I have said, most of the capital cities, they came along the routes of communication. So the routes of communication are actually the spots of towns. Why? Here comes a very interesting fact. Because the routes of communication, if you have command over routes of communication, for example land route, for example riverine route, that they are the routes of communication. Normally the roads, the land routes and even the rivers, they will become the routes of communication because trade happens through them, because they are actually the connections, cultural contacts and even the commercial network. Which forms the commercial network? The roads and the rivers, they will actually the part of commercial network. And if someone can control the routes of communication, normally they would become rich. That kingdom would become rich. Why? Because routes of communication will actually bring lot of revenues to the treasury of king. They bring lot of revenues to the treasuries of the king. Understood? So most of the towns, they are situated along the routes of the communication. So let me give you some examples. The first town is Pataliputra. First town is Pataliputra. So if you see the Pataliputra, it was actually started, it came into Indian history when we study about the Magadha. So first out of Mahajanapadas, Magadha was the one which made the Patali Grama, which was actually a village. It made, the Magadhan kings made it a capital city of them, and that was, the name was changed to Pataliputra. So if you see Pataliputra, which is a very very important town after 600 BC, especially the capital city of from the Magadhans, it was the capital city of Magadha. After that it was the capital city of Mauryans, and even till Gupta Empire, this was it survived. It was very crucial. It played a very crucial role, Pataliputra, in the ancient Indian history. So this capital city, actually it was a city when Magadhan kings shifted their capital city from Rajgir to Pataliputra. From there onwards it became it flourished. It became flourished. So this Pataliputra is actually along the riverine communication or riverine route, that is Ganga. So where Pataliputra is located? Pataliputra is located just along the Ganga river. So it is along the riverine route. Why perhaps just imagine why Magadhan kings, the latter Magadhans, changed their capital city from Rajgir to Pataliputra? It was because when they shifted to Pataliputra, actually this is a place where the Ganga river changes its turn. It becomes a a curve there, and it flows through the southwards and goes into the West Bengal and then meets the Bay of Bengal. So it is this turning of Ganga here in the Bihar at Pataliputra. Pataliputra means the present day Patna. Present day Patna. So that became very crucial spot to control it. And whoever controls this Pataliputra or the Ganga, river Ganga's turning in the Bihar, they will get lot of revenue by controlling that area. How? Because lot of trade happens through them, through this Ganga river and all these spots of rivers. So whenever trade happens, who can command the routes of communication, they will get lot of revenue in the form of fees by offering the protection to the traders or the merchants. So that is why Pataliputra is actually along the river Ganga. So that is one of the example to say most of the towns after 600 BC, they came along the routes of communication. Pataliputra. Now, let me give you second example. Not only that, if you see the town after 600 BC, one of the famous town, even it was a provincial town when Mauryans ruled after 300 BC during this period. So that was Ujjain. Ujjain. So Ujjain is actually in the present day Madhya Pradesh. Sir, if you see this Ujjain, it is not along the riverine channel, or it is not along a river. but it is it is actually along a very very important land route, very important land route. And through this land route, if you see, Ujjain is a city which is located along the wrong land route, and this land route will take the trade from North India into South India. So Ujjain will actually act as a gate between North Indian trade and South Indian trade. So if I was a merchant, or after 600 BC to 600, in between this period, if I was a merchant, if I have to do trade, I am a North Indian merchant, I want to trade some goods in South India. So through which city I have to go? I have to go through this Ujjain. And when I was going through the Ujjain, normally my goods, whatever I am taking with me to sell there in the South India, they were to be protected. So who should give that protection along the route? It is the Ujjain local rulers. So normally by this way, I will pay some tax or fee to them in return of the protection that I receive. So this is how the Ujjain flourished in this period. That Ujjain city even flourished during this period. So to Pataliputra is along the Ganga riverine route, Ujjain is along the land route. And let me give you another example. If you see the third city, it is Mathura. The city Mathura. So Mathura is in the present Uttar Pradesh. And this Mathura is also along the land route, just like Ujjain. Along the land route. It is also one of the route of communication. If you have listened that the Silk Road of which connects the China to Asia to the West Asia and Europe. Through that Silk Road, normally Chinese and Indian trade, lot of bulky trade happens between Europe and Asia. So that Silk Road, actually this takes a turn into India at this Mathura place. Understand? So from Afghanistan, the Silk Road enters from Afghanistan, it reaches till Takshila in the Pakistan, the present day Indian subcontinent. When Indian subcontinent was there, Takshila was a part of Indian subcontinent. But right now it is in Pakistan. So first Silk Road would come from West Asia to Afghanistan, and after from Afghanistan to Takshila, and from Takshila to Mathura, and at Mathura, that means just near the Delhi. After Mathura, it takes a turn and enters the route of Ujjain, and from there to the deep south. It was a land route. So Ujjain, Mathura, Takshila, and the Pataliputra, you are getting the connection, right? Most of the cities are coming up along the routes of communication. Now, let me also give another example. That if you see in the deep south, this is the India. In the deep south, you will see at the coast in the Tamil Nadu, there is a coastal place called as Puhar. So this Puhar is actually a coastal place in the Tamil Nadu. This is also a city flourished after 600 BC, because from here lot of trade happens through the Bay of Bengal. So it is a sea line. So I have given examples like Pataliputra was along the Ganga river, a riverine route, and Ujjain and Mathura and Takshila are along the land route, and cities like Puhar came up along the coastal line. That means sea route. So what you are understanding from all these examples, you should understand that routes of communication are very very important in the ancient India, and all the cities and all the capital cities of Mahajanapadas or the all ancient Indian cities have come up along the routes of communication. Now, so this is what about the towns. So you understood, right? So it is a period of second urbanization, and most of the cities are actually the capital cities of Mahajanapadas. And then the city, for example, Pataliputra, it is along the river Ganga, so it controls the riverine route. And the city like Ujjain is along the land route, and it controls the trade through the land route. And a city like Mathura is also along the land route, and it also controls the trade through land route. So this is how the towns have come up after 600 BC. after 600 BC. Now, so I have said because of the changes in rural society, agriculture got improved and the surplus, agriculture surplus fed these cities. Yes or no? Fed these cities, and lot of people shifted from landless laborers and all other people shifted from rural areas to urban areas. Why? Because in the rural areas you have seen the differences arose, differences in rural society, landless people, landholders. So the differences have come. Whenever the landless people feel insecure in the rural areas, they shifted to urban areas. Yes or no? Now, let me discuss with you that, as I have said, cities have come up. Now let me tell you that how inside the cities people were living. So what are the characteristics of this ancient Indian urban population? Very important. So let me discuss about the urban population. This is what happening. New towns are coming up in every Mahajanapada, and all the towns are along the riverine routes and land routes and all along routes of communication in general. So when this was happening, inside those cities, who are living? So this is a question. After 600 BC to at least till 600 AD, in this ancient Indian period, inside the cities, who are living? Who are actually living? So first point to tell you is that in the rural areas, villages, who will live? Only those who are the producers of who are the agricultural producers or the farmers in general. So primary producers live in the villages or rural side of the ancient India, and those people who are secondary producers or who are tertiary in the tertiary sector, secondary sector and tertiary sector. That means other than the agricultural sector, they all will reside in the cities. They all will reside in the cities. So let me discuss with you that how urban population was actually living. My first question would be, how we, the present day people, how would we know who are living in 600 BC in a city? How would we know that? We will know through evidence and through archaeological excavations. So in the modern Indian, the historians and the archaeologists, they started excavations in the so-called ancient cities. So when they were excavating the ancient cities, what they found interestingly were not only but a range of artifacts. So whenever the historians and archaeologists of the present day, when they were reconstructing the ancient history after 1850s, they started excavating the ancient cities, and in most of the ancient cities what they found was a range of artifacts. So what are actually the artifacts? Artifacts are nothing but those articles, those material or objects or anything which were used once by the human settlers in any place. So every place will perhaps have been habituated by some people once ago. So they will use, for example, vessels, they will use a lot of ornaments, they will use some other material and objects. Even though they perish in time, they die and their bodies get decomposed, but those materials will survive and those materials will speak about them. That is how we, the present day modern people, modern historians and students of history, we will reconstruct the ancient history through the artifacts. Artifacts means the material remains of the older settlements or the older people or old habitations. So now, what are the range of artifacts we get belonging to this period, 600 BC to 600 AD? Now archaeologists and historians have went to the ancient cities, places, and they excavated them and they found lot of articles and lot of materials. What are they? So let us list out. And why I am telling this, because if you understand what are the artifacts that we recovered from those places of those cities which are belonging to 600 BC to 600 AD, if we can understand, if we can discover and list out those artifacts, we will reconstruct what are the occupations present in the urban cities. Because this is how the reconstruction of history happens. If you understand what are the materialistic world they left, we will understand what actually the occupations might be of which were in operation in the cities. I'll give you examples and you will understand it. First, I have said lot of articles, lot of material we found while we are excavating in those places, in those cities. The first of one was, for example, we have found lot of vessels. Perhaps they used them for cooking. Lot of vessels. And not only that, we found lot of figurines. Figurines means maybe stone sculptures or maybe bronze figurines. Just a small, human-like doll or toy, but made up of metal. So those are the figurines, especially of women in dancing postures or some other postures. So those figurines we actually found in the when we are excavating the cities. And not only vessels and figurines, we also found lot of tools. For example, iron tools like sickles and axes, like that. Lot of tools we found. And not only tools, we also even found even lot of weapons. This is very important. So vessels, figurines, lot of tools, lot of weapons, and we also found lot of ornaments. These are very important. We also found lot of ornaments. Now, let me give you some insight about the ornaments. If you take the ornaments which we found while we are excavating, lot of different ornaments we found. For example, not of only with one metal or one material. We found ornaments of which were made up of lot of different materials. For example, we found the ornaments which were made out of gold. We found the ornaments when we are excavating the cities, ancient cities, ornaments which are made of silver, which are made of copper, which are made of bronze, gold, silver, bronze, copper, and even we found the ornaments made up of glass. And not only that, even we found the ornaments which are made up of shell. Shell means this is a material which we found in the marine and the coastal areas. So even with that shells which we found in the sand, especially in the sands and even the coastal areas, with them ornaments were made. And not only that, even with the material called as ivory, we also found some of the ornaments. So what it is telling you, it is telling you that actually in the urban side of the ancient India, from after 600 BC and in between 600 BC to 600 AD, in this period, people were using gold. They know how to use gold and how to make jewelry out of it, and even they know how to use silver, copper, shell, glass, and even ivory. And very interestingly, even I have said when I was discussing the Indus Valley civilization, that most of the toys we found were of terracotta, a material called terracotta. What is meant by terracotta? Terracotta means it is the baked clay. Baked clay would be baked, and then out of it a toy or something would be made out of it. So terracotta, even that material was ornaments which are made up of terracotta also we found. Terracotta. So we found the vessels, we found the figurines, we found the tools, we found the weapons, and even we found the ornaments when we are excavating. And these ornaments are made up of lot of different material like gold, like silver, like copper, like shell, like glass, like ivory, and even the terracotta. So what it tells? It tells metallurgy perhaps was on development. So the knowledge of metallurgy was increased, and they were using lot of metals and lot of different materials to the making of ornaments. This is how the history reconstruction would happen normally. Now, so urban population, we found lot of artifacts when we are excavating. These are some of the artifacts I have explained you: vessels, figurines, tools, weapons, ornaments. But one is very important, which is not all these even. The very important one is what we found is the important artifact belonging to this period we found in the ancient cities. That is a fine polished pottery. We found in almost all of the ancient cities, when we excavate, a fine polished pottery. Fine polished pottery, for example, it is maybe pottery means maybe bowls or maybe dishes, but which are made of fine clay. This is the first characteristic of the pottery what we found here. Fine clay, the clay size would be very very fine, which is black in color, and on the outside of that pottery, on the pot or the dish or the dish which was made out of this fine clay, we found the glossy finish. Glossy finish. So this is very important. One of the artifacts we found is that a fine clay material with a clay pot or a clay dish or a clay bowl we found, but along with the fine clay we have seen the finishing or the polishing was done by gloss. So it was a glossy finish we found, and this is very special because till 600 BC whatever the pottery we have seen, we never have seen this polished glossy or glossy polishing of a pot. We never have seen. That is why this period is associated with, so this point is very important, 600 BC to 600 AD. The ancient cities or the urban cities were habituated to the use of northern black polished ware, and this fine polished pottery with a glossy finish is called as the northern black polished ware. So why it is called as northern black polished ware? It is because only we found these fine clay material, clay pots with a glossy finish. We found only in the northern India. That is why it is called as the northern. And then black polished. Why black polished? Because the clay which was used, fine clay, was black in color and it was polished. Polished with what? A glossy finishing was there. That is why it was polished. And ware. A ware is nothing but anything which is used to store grains or something like that. A meter, a bowl, that is what called as the ware. So northern black polished ware. This is unique pottery which was developed during this period, which was used. Northern black polishing pottery or ware was used by the ancient urban city dwellers. This is what archaeology can give us to the history. Now, so northern black polished ware is very very important contribution of ancient Indian cities to the art and architecture also, especially art. Now we have discussed about the artifacts. Why I have discussed all these things? That what we found in the excavations like vessels, figurines, tools, weapons, ornaments which are made of different material, and at the last I have discussed about the northern black polished ware. Why I discussed everything? I said in the starting when I was discussing that when you study the artifacts which we found when we are excavating the urban cities, the historians can reconstruct the occupations present in the urban cities. So how? Let us see. So now let us understand and reconstruct what are the occupational people, which occupations survived in these urban cities. So first let me tell you, as I have said, in the artifacts, ornaments we found, gold ornaments we found. That means who should actually make gold ornaments? Goldsmith. So goldsmiths were present. Goldsmiths. So it was one of the occupation. It is very natural to expect that goldsmiths were present because we found the gold ornaments. So this is perhaps one of the occupation which was present in the urban cities of the ancient India. And as I have said, a lot of tools we found, iron tools, iron agricultural tools like sickles, axes. That means even the blacksmiths were there. Yes or no? So as we have found gold or silver material, we can think that goldsmiths were present. As we have found the iron material, we can conclude that blacksmiths were also present. And not only that, if you see different, see, when the people have shifted from rural areas to urban areas, you will see they take up different occupations like weaving, because these are the people who produces cloth to the city dwellers. So weavers were there. And not only that, we have found lot of inside the artifacts, we have found some shapes of furniture, lot of different chairs like things and desk like things, but not of wood, because wood will not survive. Other material toys we found. What it tells? It tells that even the carpentry work, the carpenters were very much in demand. Carpenters. So goldsmith, blacksmith, weavers, carpenters, and even if you see the the washermen. So inside the cities, as I have said, as the weavers are producing the cloth, normally when we wear the clothes, who should wash them? To the rural elites, to the urban elites. Normally the royal families don't wash the clothes of themselves. So normally you can expect that the people, because it was a period after 600 BC, monarchy was on the rise. So normally what is monarchy? All the power would be restricted within one hand. It is in one hand, that is the king. So everything you can expect, the rights of the people can be vanished. And why don't you expect that even the royal families never wash their clothes on their own? They would always have washermen. So a new community called as washermen were started. So goldsmith, blacksmith, weavers, carpenters, washermen. So all these are the different occupations that we can expect who are present. Especially, I will tell you one thing. Because we have found lot of different materials, even the luxurious goods, vessels and everything, from the cities towards the toward the rural side, there is a trade mechanism, as I have said. Linkage was established because agriculture produced the surplus food grains and cities are producing the crafts, lot of artifacts. So in exchange to food grains, these city people are taking the food grains from rural people and they are giving their crafts to the rural people, like vessels, like pots, etc. So as I have said, north black polished ware, that means who should make the pottery. So pottery was there. And all these things were to be traded with even the rural people. So who should go and trade from the cities? It is the traders or the merchants. So goldsmith, blacksmith, weavers, carpenters, washermen, potterymen or potters, and then merchants, traders, and at the last, if you see, in the last class we discussed that even land grants were given to whom? Religious institutions. That means inside the religious institutions, you will expect religious teachers were also present. Yes or no? So religious teachers. These are the occupations. Yes or no? I am just reconstructing from the artifacts. That because ornaments were there, goldsmith and blacksmiths can be expected. Because iron tools we found, blacksmiths can be expected. Because we found, royal families and monarchy on the rise, we can expect that washermen and carpenters were there. And then because the surplus, these crafts were to be traded with food grains in the rural areas, normally we can expect merchants and traders would be there. And at the last, kings would reside in the cities. So these are all the occupational people who are residing in the cities. Understood? So now, goldsmith, blacksmith, weavers, carpenters, religious teachers, washermen, pottery, and then traders and merchants. And at the last, kings. Even kings were residing inside the cities. Now, the third important thing, associations. So what we are discussing, urban population. So associations means we have seen a lot of artifacts, we have seen the associated occupations with them. So to trade these artifacts like pottery, like all other iron tools and agricultural weapons which were made by the blacksmith of the city dwellers, So who should actually supply these to the rural side? Because agriculture needs skills, agriculture needs access, agriculture needs the tools, iron tools, and they are being produced in the cities. So who should take that tools to the iron, rural side, and who should bring this surplus food to the urban side? It is the traders. So normally trade cannot be, a large scale trade cannot be permissible or possible even with an individual. Yes or no? So normally we can expect these craft persons of the cities, sir, very important point. The craft persons of the cities mobilized themselves into associations inside every city in the ancient cities. And one such association we found in inscriptions, when we are going back the inscriptions which tell about this period. On some of the inscriptions, there is an inscription called as votive inscription. Votive inscription. Votive. What is meant by votive inscription? So inscriptions are different types. Inscription, what is meant by inscription? Inscription is nothing but the message which was engraved on a source or a stone or metal or anything else, copper plate. The message was actually the inscription. So the message can be anything. So depending upon the type of message, we will categorize the inscriptions. When I am discussing the polity of this ancient Indian period, I said there was a type of inscriptions called as prashastis. So these prashasti inscriptions actually, they are composed by the court poets of the kings, and they are always in praise of the kings. That is the prashasti inscriptions. And the second type of inscriptions are message oriented inscriptions. For example, Ashokan inscriptions. So what they are preaching to the people, they are telling the Ashokan Dhamma. And the third important, here comes the third important inscription, which is called as the votive inscription. V-O-T-I-V-E, votive inscription. So what is meant by votive inscription? A votive inscription is a record of the gifts that merchants and the association of merchants give or present to the religious institutions. So for example, to every religious institution, some people, some richer people, individuals or the associations would come and present some gifts. So normally those gifts which are given to the religious institution, they are inscribed on a stone or a copper plate or anything else. So that inscriptions which are the record of gifts to the religious institution, and that is called as the votive inscription. And when the historians are reconstructing this period of 600 BC to 600 AD, especially urban economy, they found this votive inscription, and on that they found a very important and interesting term, interesting word, and the word is, I am discussing about the associations. The word which we found on the votive inscriptions is Shreni. Sir, very very important, the word Shreni. So what is meant by Shreni? Now this word name was actually deciphered, and then the historians understood what actually this word Shreni means, which was mentioned on the votive inscription which we found. This Shreni is actually nothing but it is an association of craft persons. So Shreni means the present day, if you see, we have guilds. We have guilds. Normally we will have the guilds of merchants. Yes or no? Today, that means a group of merchants. In the same way, in the ancient period, in every city, we found these Shrenis. Shreni means they are the guilds, or they are the associations of the merchants and craftspersons. Merchants and craftspersons. So all different merchants. For example, if I was a potter, I was making pots. I will unite with all my fellow potters, and at a large scale we will sell these potters to the rural villages. As a bulky and as a group we will sell. As an association we will sell. So that what happens? Normally the bargaining power would increase. And that is why associations were formed by the merchants and associations were formed by the craft persons during this period, 600 BC to 600 AD. And those associations are called as the Shrenis. So Shreni is nothing but a guild A guild is nothing but an association of a merchant or merchants or associations of the craft persons. So normally what does this Shreni do? Shrenis will do three functions. The functions of Shreni means association of the merchants will do three functions. One is these Shrenis or the associations would go to the people and procure the raw material. For example, if this is a group of potters, normally what they require, the raw material was clay and water. So they would go to the soil and they collectively go and they will collect the clay. So they procure the raw material. That is the first point. So Shreni will procure the raw material. And the second function, once they procure the raw material, the association, the same association of the craft persons or the potters or anybody, that association will regulate the production. So how many pots should be produced, and in one day how many pots should be produced, and to which this production was to be aimed for. So all this regulation of the production would be seen by these Shrenis. So second important function is regulation of the production. So Shrenis will procure the raw material, first point, and Shrenis would regulate the production, second point. And the third important function what they would do is, after the finishing of product, whether it is if it is a Shreni of goldsmith, after the finishing of jewelry, if it is a blacksmith Shreni, association of blacksmiths, they after the production of iron tool. So just like that, after the final product got produced, they will market the final or finished products. So marketing of finished products. So these are the three important functions what a Shreni would do in this period, 600 BC to 600 AD. What are they? One is the procurement of raw material, and this Shreni would regulate the production, and the Shreni would market the finished product. These are the three important works or the functions of a Shreni. A Shreni is nothing but an association. Association of whom? Association of a merchants or association of a craftspersons. So by this we have completed the urban population. So what we discussed in the urban population, we discussed the artifacts what we found, and after that we discussed about the occupations. Based on the artifacts we reconstruct the history, that how many occupations perhaps would be there in the cities. And then we also discussed about the associations like Shrenis etc. inside the cities. So this is how the urban cities were growing up. Now let us understand now how the trade was happening. So how they are arranging the trade, and how Indian subcontinent was actually trading with the world even. So how, this is the first point, towns we discussed, and now let us discuss about the trade. So during this period 600 BC to 600 AD, we have seen first the rise of Mahajanapadas, after then Mauryan Empire, after then lot of different states like Shatavahanas, Shekas, Kushanas. After that we have seen the rise of the Guptas, at the last Gupta Empire. So all these people in this 1200 years period, they have traded within the country and among themselves and even outside the Indian subcontinent. So how that was possible? How this trade was possible? Now I am going to tell you the important point. First, let us discuss about within the subcontinent how the trade was organized. Within the subcontinent. First point is that we have seen lot of land routes, as I have explained. So right from the northwestern Indian subcontinent, that is Takshila, to Mathura, to Ujjain, to the deep south. And from Mathura, again if we go to the eastwards, that will reach the Pataliputra, that is the present day Bihar. So land routes are very, very important for the flourishing of trade within the subcontinent. Very good land routes were there. They were developed, even every kingdom developed very good land routes. And even they protected the land routes. The local rulers should protect the land routes from attacking of robbers and everybody. And not only the land routes, even the riverine routes, or let me tell you, the river routes. So land routes and the riverine or sea routes. These are the two important routes which, so inside the subcontinent when we discuss, I call it as riverine route. But when we discuss about beyond the subcontinent, they are sea routes. So if you see, this is our Indian subcontinent. This is Pakistan, this is Afghanistan. So all are called as the Indian subcontinent. So not Afghanistan but till Pakistan. So throughout the India, you have seen a very good connection of roads. So that is called the land routes connection network. And within the subcontinent, we have lot of rivers like Ganga river, like Brahmaputra river in the northeastern India, and like Indus river in the northwestern subcontinent, and like Narmada river in the Gujarat and central India, and lot of this is how my point here is that land routes and riverine routes, they completely crisscrossed the subcontinent. So they crisscrossed the subcontinent everywhere. Every city and every region or every kingdom, smaller kingdom, was connected to these land routes and riverine routes in one or the other way. And because of the presence of very good land routes and riverine routes inside the subcontinent, the trade got flourished. So without them, trade was impossible. Now, if you see the kings from Mahajanapadas, like Magadhan kings, after that Ashoka, after that the Mauryans, after that post-Mauryans, Shakas, Shatavahanas, Kushanas, then Guptas. Whoever you take, who ruled in between 600 BC to 600 AD, everyone, very important point I am going to tell you. Everyone tried to control these land routes and riverine routes. So control over routes of communication. So every king, including, for example, let me give an example. A very perfect and apt example is Shatavahanas. Actually, Shatavahanas, they flourished only because of this control over the routes of communication. Not only, but majorly, because they became too rich by the revenue they got by giving protection to the routes of communication. So land routes and river routes, every king wanted to control over these land routes and riverine routes within the subcontinent, so that what they would get in return the revenue, because they give protection to the merchants when they are moving along the road or when they are moving inside a river. They would be protected by the local rulers or the local kings, so that they would get lot of revenue. Yes or no? So with revenue, they still grow powerful, every kingdom. And that is how the inside subcontinent or inside the trade was happened. Now, so this is what within the subcontinent. The trade within the subcontinent was possible because of land routes and riverine routes. And every king wanted to control over the land routes and riverine routes. Now, within the subcontinent, if you see, what are the main products or main items that were traded? Main items. So let me tell you just a smaller, understanding. If this is India, if this is Indian subcontinent, this is like Pakistan, all the Indian subcontinent. First, you understand that we have a very long coastal line. So normally all the coastal line and the coastal people, they would produce lot of salt. Yes or no? So lot of salt is available. Normally, my point is here, salt is available in bounty along the coastal lines, but the same salt is unavailable to these landlocked states. Normally, for example, a state like Delhi, a state like Madhya Pradesh. So they could not get salt in such bounty amounts as the coastal people would get. So normally what these merchants would do, they would take the salt from coastal areas and they would reach the northern India. This is how inside subcontinent trade. So salt was one of the material to be traded. And what you understood from this example, you have to understand, wherever there is a surplus, and wherever there is scarcity, these two would be connected by trade. And trade is actually the equalizer of material distribution. So salt was abundant in the coastal areas. So merchants of coastal areas would take the salt from coastal areas to deep India, to the landlocked states where salt was unavailable, so that a trade mechanism happens. So what are the main items which are traded? One is salt. So one is salt, and not only salt, even the food grains. First one is salt, and then food grains. Why food grains? Because if you see Ganga plains and Ganga, like Uttar Pradesh region, Bihar region, lot of rice would be produced. But if you see the Punjab and Haryana region, not the rice, but wheat is produced because of the soil presence and even the geographical reasons. So normally this rice which was produced in the Bihar and UP area would be traded with the Punjab and Haryana area, and the North Indian crops would be traded with the South Indian people, and the South Indian crops would be traded with the, so like that, food grains are the second important material to be traded within the subcontinent. And not only that, textiles. Textiles means clothes. So clothes are the need to everyone. So normally throughout the Indian subcontinent, these traders or the association of traders would trade these textiles. Trade in the textiles and salt, grains, textiles, and not only that, even for example spices. Even the items which were traded, for example medicinal plants. Even these medicinal plants were also traded. So even the artifacts, whatever the artifacts they have produced, they were traded. So did you understand what I am going to tell you? That the trade within the subcontinent was possible because of the land routes and riverine routes, and every king was trying to control over them, have the control over the routes. And the main important material items which were traded were salt, were grains, were textiles, were spices, were medicinal plants, etc. So this is the trade within the subcontinent. Now let us understand the trade in this period 600 BC to 600 AD beyond the subcontinent. So land route was actually, if you see, this is India. Again, I'm explaining the same example. This is India and this is Pakistan. So this is Indian subcontinent. The land route from here, this is Afghanistan. From Afghanistan, Takshila of the Pakistan. This is a Silk Route connection. From Takshila to Delhi. So from Delhi to Mathura, UP, and from Mathura to Ujjain, which is Madhya Pradesh, and then to deep south. So this is the actually land route. Yes or no? So now, when we discuss the trade beyond, first we will discuss with the land route how the trade happened beyond the Indian subcontinent. Indian subcontinent, whatever they produce, like salt, like as I have explained, salt, textiles, even the spices and even the medicinal plants, all these material would be traded from Ujjain to Mathura, from Mathura to Delhi, from Delhi to Takshila, and beyond Takshila it would reach Afghanistan, and after that it would reach the Central Asia. So the land route was directly connected to Central Asia. Yes or no? So if a guild or if a Shreni or association of merchants would start from Ujjain with their bulk amount of goods, they would normally go through all these cities and they would reach the Central Asia one day and they would trade there. And not only that, from Afghanistan, if they take a turn, that will lead to China. So we have the land route connection from Indian subcontinent to Central Asia and the land route connection from the Indian subcontinent to China. And this is how the land route trade was happened with. For example, if you just this is west, and if you go to still westward, you will reach the West Asia. So this is how the land route trade beyond the subcontinent was happened. Beyond the subcontinent. Now let me tell you the second important factor. Beyond the subcontinent, how the trade happened through riverine route. riverine route. Now, again, this is India. Just imagine this is India. So this is the coastal area. Everything, this is Bay of Bengal. Yes or no? Bay of Bengal. And this is Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia. And this would be the China. So just imagine, from here, this is the Pataliputra. From Pataliputra, Ganga takes a turn and it would enter into West Bengal. And along the river West Bengal, it reaches till the coastal area of maybe the Andhra Pradesh, or maybe the Orissa, or maybe the West Bengal and Bangladesh. And from there, imagine, very very important, from here the trade would go through the Bay of Bengal and it would be reached to Southeast Asia. So through Bay of Bengal, the amount of maybe the items and the caravans of goods would be reached to the Southeast Asia. And from Southeast Asia, if they circumvent the Southeast Asia, that would reach the China. This is China. So this is the eastward sea trade. If you see from within the rivers, Ganga river and Narmada river and all other rivers, Indus river, they would take the goods from inside the subcontinent to the coastal areas, and from there through the Bay of Bengal, the trade relations between Southeast Asia is possible. And if we just go around the Southeast Asia, it will reach the China. This is how even the sea route trade beyond the Indian subcontinent happened. And if you go westwards, this is Arabian Sea. Arabian Sea. So normally from along the Ganga and then along the Narmada, it will reach the Gujarat region. From Gujarat region, it enters into Arabian Sea. The trade, I mean the goods, will enter into Arabian Sea. And after that, they would reach the West Asia. This is West Asia. So this is West Asia. Through the Arabian Sea, we will reach the West Asia. And then from West Asia, if we still move further, this would be Africa. Africa, the Eastern Africa and Northern Africa. And if you take a turn here from West Asia, you would reach the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean Sea, and this Mediterranean Sea would open to the Europe. So this is what the trade, very important trade through the sea between Indian subcontinent and the world. I am again giving the clarity. To the eastern side, through the Bay of Bengal, we will trade with the Southeast Asia, and then it will be reaching to the China. And towards the west side, the goods will reach first the Gujarat, and from the Gujarat through the Arabian Sea, they would reach the Western Asia, and from Western Asia, if they take a leftward turn, they would reach the Africa, and if they take a rightward turn through the Suez Canal of Africa and West Asia, in between them Suez Canal would be there, and through the Suez Canal they would reach the Mediterranean Sea. But in the ancient times, Suez Canal was not there. It was an artificially constructed canal, Suez Canal. But they would first reach the Africa, and from there just a small land connection, and they would now reach the Mediterranean Sea. Through the Mediterranean Sea, the goods or the merchants will reach the Europe, and this is how the guilds or the shrenis did the international trade. This is what the ancient Indian urban society was. Ancient Indian urban economy was. It was possible. So just imagine 600 BC to 600 AD. They did not have steamships, steamers. They did not have big ships. They have to go only in the wooden boats. So very traditional boats. How they can take those goods through the riverine route, to bulky goods through the riverine routes to such a distance lands. So just imagine, it was very very risky, but still the merchants did that. Why the merchants have taken such huge risk to trade between India and other contemporary empires? I'll tell you the reason why. Just after some time I will tell you the reason. But for now, just have a closer here. So we have discussed about the trade. Inside the trade, first we discussed within the subcontinent. That is, because of the presence of land routes and riverine routes, it was possible, and kings were controlling those routes. and they are getting the revenue back. Even the kingdoms are flourishing. Even the trade was flourishing. It was a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship. And beyond subcontinent, it was possible because of the presence of Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea. So Indian subcontinent, through the inland rivers, they would reach the Bay of Bengal. Through the Bay of Bengal, they would reach the Southeast Asia and then to China. And towards the western side, Arabian Sea, through the Arabian Sea, Western Asia, and West Asia to either Africa or Mediterranean Sea. And through the Mediterranean Sea, Europe can be connected. This is how the trade beyond subcontinent happened between the 600 BC to 600 AD. In the ancient India, so that's why this period was referred to as the glorious period of Indian history. Glorious period. Now, so we have seen the general outline, how the trade happened. Now let us understand the specifics of it. That is, how many types of traders were there? What are the categories of traders? The categories of traders. Now, as I have explained already, traders and merchants, they are very, very important to the economy. Merchants and traders, they are very, very important to run the economy, for the economy to flourish. And in the same way, between the 600 BC to 600 AD also, lot of Shrenis were there, as I have explained, association of the merchants and craftspersons. But in general, if you see in the economy of ancient India, especially urban economy, how many types of traders were there? Very important, sir. This is very important because you will understand once you have it. Inside the subcontinent, as I have explained, one type of traders would be there, and beyond the subcontinent to trade with, another type of traders are needed, or merchants are needed. Yes, sir, no, the organization is needed. For example, there are in this period, there are three important types of or categories of traders. Let us discuss about them in each one. One is peddlers. Peddlers. So who are peddlers? Sir, these are very small petty traders. Petty traders, sir. For example, they would just go on foot. These peddlers would go on foot. They just walk. And along with them, they will carry one animal, or on their back itself, they would take the articles they want to sell from the cities to the rural areas. And they walk in every village and they will sell those artifacts. For example, an iron axe or an iron sickle, for example, timber, for example, textiles, anything, but in a very little smaller quantity. An individual can become a trader, and that's how petty traders, called as the petty traders, like peddlers, they carried the needs of the rural people. They have become a link between rural people's smaller domestic articles and city people's food grains. So they became the connections between the city and rural areas. So peddlers are the first type of traders who always only walks on foot. They carry their material along on their back, or along with them a small donkey or just like an animal would be there, and on the back of it their articles are packed, and they go to the villages and they will sell it. This is the first way of trading, called as the peddlers. They are very important, sir. In a rural society, they are very important. You cannot expect a DMart like MNC companies and MNC retail stores in villages. You can expect only the peddlers. They are actually very suitable to them, even to the villages, especially we are speaking of 600 BC. So their importance is very, very, we should not neglect them. And the second type of traders, they are the merchants. As I have said, peddlers are very important in the rural side, especially to trade from towns to the rural side, smaller domestic articles. But these merchants are very important inside the subcontinent. Throughout the subcontinent, they actually distribute the surplus goods to the scarcity areas, and they became actually the equalizers of society through their economy, through their trade. So, for example, trades, as I have said, peddlers would just walk, but these will go in caravans. Caravans of what? Caravans of bullock cart. So each merchant or each association of merchants called as guilds or the shrenis, they will have their own caravans of bullock cart, and in those bullock carts they would fill up with all the material like salt and whatever the goods they want to trade with textiles, salt or medicinal plants or whatever, even the artifacts like ornaments and even the iron tools, etc. So they would take all in their caravans of bullock carts, and along with the caravans they even have animal packups. Animals, along with them some animals would be there like donkeys, and along their back also they are packed up. So these merchants, they would trade along the land routes, inside the subcontinent. Mostly inside the subcontinent, these merchants would carry their caravans. Inside the caravans, all the materials to be to be traded can be filled up. So bullock carts would be there normally, and along with them animals, and those animals are packed on their back with the goods to be traded, and these merchants would go on trade for months and months. Once they go to certain area from North India to South India, they would take even 1 month, 2 month time period, and they will trade. So seasonal trade, just like that. These are the second important types of traders within the subcontinent, and these merchants would trade along the land routes. Now, the third important types of the traders who are still very important, sir, still very important. These are the seafarers. As I have explained just 5 minutes before. This is the coastal India. This is the Gujarat. From here, this is Arabian Sea. All the goods from northern India would come to here, would reach here through the land route, like in the caravans, as I have explained. And from here, through the Arabian Sea, they would reach the Western Asia, and after that they would reach the Africa, and then they would reach the Europe. So for all these, this seafaring is very important. Seafaring is very important, but the period is 600 BC to 680. They are not well equipped with lot of ships and electronic ships and engines, etc. They are just natural boats with, very traditional boating mechanism, traditional navigation. So it is always very risky to go through the seas. It is always very risky. That's why seafarers are actually very important. But let me tell you, sir, very important point. These seafarers trade is very risky. Very risky. Why? It is because they have to travel through the seas. These merchants would only go through the land routes. So the risk involved is very low. But here the seafarers should go through the seas. One is natural calamities, obstruction, natural threat. Another one is even the pirates, for example robbers. But only merchants will have the threat of robbers. But there is no threat of natural, threats, especially like tsunamis, etc. But for them, even that natural threats are very important to consider in this plan of trading. So this sea trade of the seafarers is very, very risky, because where there is risk, sir, this is very important. Please imagine, please understand. Where there is risk, that will give you lot of profit also. So whoever takes more risk, they will even get the benefits, and benefits also in the same proportion. For example, these seafarers are also the most profitable traders. Why? I'll tell you the reason why. One is because of their riskiness, but another one is these seafarers were actually to trade with whom? The other empires of the world. They are not the Indian subcontinent, but they are other empires of the world. Other empires. For example, in this period, the contemporaries of the 600 BC to 680, in the ancient Indian period, what are the contemporary empires? We have, for example, in the Europe, we have Roman Empire. So here Roman Empire was there. When we have this ancient Indian empires, Roman Empire, and in the Iran, that is in the Western Asia, we have Parthians, Romans and Parthians. So normally these seafarers actually were to trade between Indian subcontinent and Parthians and Indian subcontinent and the Romans. And here comes the actual point. These Romans are Europeans. They are in the middle latitudes and we are in the tropical zone. So the type of material we produce in the tropical region, for example, let me tell you three important products. One is spices. So spices are more grown only in the tropical regions because our Indian geography and the temperature levels, rainfall levels and the geography is sufficient and necessary for the production of spices. But this was not possible in the Europe because of its it is in the temperate zone, the middle latitudes, but we are in the lower latitudes, the tropical. We are between Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. So spices we can produce, but they cannot produce. So normally when they see spices, their tongue will not stop. So once they have spices in their curries, normally they don't forget it. They will think even more and more spices they want. And you can just imagine if a seafarer can take these spices from India to Europe by some way, but with all the hurdles, if he can take two or three bullock carts of spices to this Roman Empire, you just imagine how much rich he would become just with one time trade. That's how profitability of these seafarers were very, very important. At the same time, the risk is also involved is very high for seafarers. So one product which is very demanded, having the demand in the international market during this period, 600 BC to 600 AD, it is the spices. And not only the spices, second important product which has high demand in the Roman Empire and Parthians of Iran were the textiles. Textiles means cotton and the jute, all this natural fiber made clothes. For example, ours is again the same reason. Ours is a tropical country. So we are in between Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. So the cotton which was grown here in this peninsula region, especially Deccan region, like Maharashtra region, Telangana region and another Madhya Pradesh region, the cotton which is grown here is very qualitative. Fine cotton yarn, fine cotton thread, fibers can be obtained from our cotton. So the quality of the cotton is very important for making of a good cloth. So normally the textiles what our ancient Indian people would produce are very qualitative. So these textiles were in much demand in the Europe and the West Asia. So spices and textiles, they are in very much demand in the Roman Empire and the Iranians or the Parthians of Iran. And not only that, these are the two products. And the third important product which is in high demand international product was medicinal plants. Why medicinal plant? I'll tell you. Again the same reason, sir. Again the same reason. We are in the tropical region. So in the tropical region you can expect the evergreen forests. And only in the evergreen forest you will see lot of different types of flora flourishes. The different species of plants comes up. And our Indians naturally, as we have seen lot of different types of plants in a forest, we would know the medicinal value of different plants. And this type of plant diversity was not present in the Europe. Because they are in the middle latitudes, most of them they don't have direct sunlight. So the plant variations were very low, and the forests were not thick enough or evergreen enough like in India. So they don't get such huge types of plants there. So the medicinal value these plants have is being exploited by our Indian merchants, and they trade these medicinal plants with the Europeans, especially the Roman Empire and the contemporary empires. So spices, textiles and the medicinal plants, these are the three important products which were having highest demand in the international market. During the ancient period, sir, maybe my tone, you are understanding it as a modern, right? You are understanding all these things as a modern era. Actually it was. Even though it was ancient Indian economy, it was the reality. This is what happening at that time period, 600 BC to 600 AD. So these are the peddlers, merchants, and then seafarers. And seafarers are the people who involved in all this international, trading. That is the reason they actually have, they got lot of profits than the peddlers. Most of the times even merchants and seafarers would be same. For example, one group of merchants would be there and they would also act as the seafarers most of the times. So these peddlers are just petty traders inside the subcontinent. Now, so as we have discussed the three categories of the people, three categories of the traders inside our Indian subcontinent: peddlers, merchants, and seafarers. Over the time, as the time progressed, peddlers were trading inside the subcontinent, merchants are trading inside the subcontinent and also outside the subcontinent, seafarers are trading outside the subcontinent. From 600 BC at least till 300, 400 AD, it went on. As the time progresses, what happens was, these merchants and seafarers, that's a very important point. Merchants and seafarers, they would grow in their wealth and power to such an extent, even they become, most of these merchants and seafarers who involved in this international trade and even the Indian trade, they became successful merchants most of the time. Most of them became very powerful and rich. Successful merchants. Over the time period, merchants and seafarers would grow in their wealth and power. And let me tell you some of the examples of these successful merchants who traded inside the India and even the outside India. The ancient texts or the literature mentions three important terms or words about these successful merchants. The three important words, very important, sir. One word is a Tamil word. One word is a Tamil word. It is actually Masattuvan. Masattuvan. So who was a Masattuvan? Masattuvan means they were actually, in Tamil, Masattuvan means a very good successful merchants. In Tamil, these Masattuvans are actually the successful merchants, and they became too wealthy and even too powerful in the deep south, in the Tamil Nadu region and etc. So this word is very important, Masattuvans. So during this period, Masattuvans are involved in this trade and seafaring, in this Indian trading and international trading. International trading in the spices, in the textiles and in the medicinal plants. And the second important word which was mentioned was in Prakrit language. So normally when we study inscriptions, most of these ancient inscriptions are in either Tamil or Prakrit and Pali languages. So in the Prakrit language we found two important words about these merchants, successful merchants and seafarers. One word is Shetty. Shettis. Who are Shettis? Shettis are the successful merchants and successful seafarers who became too rich, who became too powerful in the northern Indian, especially northern India. Shettis, and not only Shettis, another word of Prakrit. Another word. These are the three important words. Masattuvan is a Tamil word which mentions about the merchants and seafarers, and the Shettis are also the successful merchants which is mentioned in the Prakrit language. And another word in the same Prakrit language mentioned about the merchants was the Sattavahanas. Sattavahans. Latter. Yes, the same people whom you are thinking about. These Sattavahanas are actually the most successful merchants and who are benefited the most from the seafaring and the merchantship. And these Sattavahanas later, by becoming too rich and powerful, even they established their own rule by 200 BC. You will see the Shatavahanas, they later become the Shatavahanas. So they are actually the successful merchants who benefited the most from the merchantship and the trading. So these are the three important words which mentioned in the literature about this ancient period merchants. One was Masattuvan, which was a Tamil word. and another one was Shetty, which was a Prakrit word, and another word was Saptavahanas. All these three words actually mentioning about these successful merchants. So these three are successful merchants who involved in the trading inside the India and even the outside India, and they benefited the most. They became too rich, even they became too powerful. This is what the about the traders. Now, so we have discussed about the towns, the new cities. We have discussed about the urban population, artifacts, occupations and associations. We discussed about the trade within the subcontinent and beyond the subcontinent. And we also discussed about the categories of traders, peddlers, merchants and the seafarers. Now, within the trade, and that is within the urban economy itself, another third important dimension after towns and trade is coins and the kings. So this is very important, sir. Coins and king. Why? Because before 600 BC, if you see, the economy was very simple. If you see early Vedic period, 1500 BC to 1000 BC, they are very rural in nature. Their economy was very simple. They are only producing food material. So normally what they have done was, if I was a rice producer, rice was not there, a wheat producer in the early Vedic period, and if some other person was a food collector, means he will go to the forest and he will collect the fruits. So I need fruits and he needs my wheat. We used to just exchange each other. That was the simplest form of economy, the early Vedic period and even the later Vedic period, especially early Vedic period. And sir, here the point is, in the simple economy or in the simple society, normally just goods are exchanged for another good, and this is called as this system of exchange, direct exchange of goods between two people. For example, I want the collected fruits. Who was collecting the fruits from forest? I want those fruits. It is my want, and I have this wheat. He wants it. It is his want. That means this is the double coincidence of wants. We both are wanting each other's material. That is how the first simple economy survived. The simple economy exchanges happened, and that system was called as the barter exchange system. Barter exchange system. What is barter exchange system? This system is actually based on the principle of double coincidence of wants. It only works in the simple economies like early Vedic economy, because for one good another good can be exchanged. To that happen, I should want other good and the other person should want my good. Only that, then only it was possible. Barter system of exchange. And in the latter Vedic period, if you see, the same person, the same me, when I was producing only the food material in early Vedic period, now not only food material, I was even producing in the latter Vedic period, I was even producing the cloth. I was even producing forest produce. So now the goods, the basket of goods became in the society more. So for example, if somebody was having the cloth and if I was having the food material, I want the fruits, not the cloth. But he will not give me that cloth because he doesn't want my food. So you can here observe that as the society becomes complex, as the number of goods produced in the society becomes complex, this double coincidence of wants. For example, I need yours material and you need my material. Then only double coincidence, the barter system was possible. But as the society became complex, it was not possible. Because I need the third material, which is something which is not at you. I need that material, but he needs your material. So you cannot exchange your material with him. At the same time, you cannot get that material which you wanted. If you just apply this barter system, that is how, as the society became complex, by 600 BC, even after the Vedic period, to the food material, to the clothes, and even to the forest produce, lot of other services were added. For example, weaving service, washing service. For example, craftsmen had come up. So lot of different services, lot of goods were come up in the economy. So literally, it was impossible to pursue this barter system of exchange. And in that scenario, by 600 BC, for the first time, because the barter system was not possible, because this barter system which is based on the double coincidence of wants, it was not possible. For the first time, the kings and some other people in the society started issuing the coins. So now what happens? I have a material 1 with me, and some other person was having material 2 with him, and another person was having the material 3 with him. Actually, I want material 3, but my material is not being wanted by him, so I cannot exchange with him. Barter system was not possible. And what these people by 600 BC, what the society did was, they introduced a material called as coin. So first, what I do, for the coins, he will sell his product, and with the same coins, I will brought the product from him. Understood? So in between the people, first a common medium of exchange. Even this material 2 person was there. He wants my product. So first he would give the same coin to me so that I can give my product to him. And this coin which I got from him by selling my product, I would give to him so that he will give his product to me. So now this coin was actually became common medium of exchange. It eliminated the double coincidence of bonds. It eliminated that, and that is how coinage was started. So what is the need of a coin? Coins were needed by 600 BC. It was the need because it was literally impossible to continue with the barter system of exchange. It was literally impossible to have the double coincidence of wants in a society where variety of goods are produced, variety of services are produced. So a wants cannot just meet with each other's wants. Normally, two people's wants cannot meet to exchange in between them. So in that scenario, a medium of exchange has come, that is called as the coin. That is what's called as the coin. Now, I have explained you about the barter exchange system and the need of the coinage. So because the barter exchange system was not possible in this complex society, for the first time coins were issued. Now let us understand the evolution of coins. So how the coins were started from 600 BC. Before 600 BC there were no coins. After 600 BC to at least till 600 AD they were there, and afterwards also they continued even till today. Now let us see this evolution of coins during this period, 600 BC to 600 AD. How the coins were evolved. First, so very important. The first coins which were issued at around 600 BC, they are not the coins which are same as the present day coins. They are the punch marked coins. They are the punch marked coins. Punch marked coins. What is punch marked coin? Normally a metal is taken, and on the metal a punch has been made. That punch may be anything. For example, most of the times it was a symbol. From 600 BC to around 200 BC, this practice of punch marked coins was there. That means Mahajanapadas, which was started in the 600 BC, they also issued the punch marked coins. And the Mauryan Empire, by 200 BC, Mauryan Empire got declined. Even the Mauryan Empire also issued the punch marked coins. So for every dynasty there was a different symbol. So coins were issued. Now let me tell you an important point here. Coins were not only issued by the kings. The coins were also issued by the merchants. Coins were also issued by the bankers. And coins were also issued by the townspeople. Why? Because for merchants it is very important actually than kings. Because merchants would go for a long distance trade, and wherever they go, first they will sell their products and they will get the coins which they were issuing. First they will give the coins and they will take whatever the product they want. and then they will go to some other place and they will sell them for more coins. That's how they became actually like, they acted like RBI, the present day RBI. So for them it was very important rather than the king. So along, kings were also issued, they are political in nature mostly, because they have their own symbols, and to just get the name and fame they used to do that. At the same time economic use. But most of the times merchants and bankers, they both acted as the present day RBI. They have issued the coins most of the times, merchants and bankers. Even the townspeople, inside the towns also some people have issued the coins. Who issued the coins? When someone asks you, in the ancient period, not only the king, even the merchants, bankers and even the townspeople have issued the coins. So the first evolution of the coins, first coin was Panchmarked coin. Panchmarked coin was used in between 600 BC to 200 BC, and the punch which was used on the metal was mostly a symbol. And another important point about Panchmarked coins is before 200 BC, right? So these Panchmarked coins from 600 BC to 200 BC, mostly they are of metal. First the metal copper, and after that we have even seen the metal silver. So Panchmarked coins are of actually copper and silver. Very important point. Now this is the first stage of the coinage. And now we are at the timeline 200 BC. By 200 BC, the second important coins, for example, on a coin, an image was there and a name was there. So this evolution from Panchmarked coins, image and name of the rulers was minted by Indo-Greeks. So very important. So who are Indo-Greeks? Indo-Greeks are the people who ruled in the northwestern portion of Indian subcontinent from 200 BC, and these Indo-Greeks issued the next level coins other than the Panchmarked coins. They are containing the name of the ruler and the image of the ruler. That was the important development by the Indo-Greeks, and this development got further improved, and by 0 to 100 AD, if you see, for the first time the gold coins were issued, and even these Indo-Greeks were issued the same silver and copper coins. So for the first time the gold coins were issued by Kushanas. So first Panchmarked coins started in 600 BC, they continued till 200 BC. In the 200 BC Indo-Greeks came, and these Indo-Greeks issued the name and image of the ruler on the coins, and it continued till 0 AD. And in 0 AD, for the first time, Kushanas came and they issued the gold coins. And these Kushanas have traded with Romans. They have even traded with Parthians. So these gold coins are very, very important in our Indian history. First issuance of gold coins was done by Kushanas. And another important point is, the gold coins which are issued by Kushanas, they are standardized in weight. So they are standardized in their weight. So what it tells? It tells why standardization of gold happens. Every coin is of same weight. It tells that actually trade was very important, and the value of transactions not only happening inside the country but even with the outside empires like Roman Empire. That is the reason standardization has happened between the Roman Empire and the Kushana Empire. So gold coins were for the first time issued by the Kushanas. Now, in the evolution, first Panchmarked coins, then the Indo-Greeks issued names and rulers of the images of the rulers coins, and the third important types of coins were by the Kushanas. They are the gold coins. Now the fourth important coins which were issued by in the evolution of coins issued by the Guptas. Guptas issued the gold coins. So these are considered to be the spectacular gold coins. They are very, very spectacular than the Kushanas. This is by 300 AD. So Guptas issued the gold coins which are very spectacular to such an extent. These gold coins are very pure. So they are very distinguished for their purity. And the second important thing about the gold coins issued by the Kushanas was, even these are very much standardized. So they are very pure and even they are very much standardized. So the gold coins were issued by these Guptas. So first gold coins issued by Kushanas, but the purified and the most spectacular gold coins issued by the Guptas. So actually these Guptas are the people who are benefited the most from the trade with Roman Empire. So by 300 AD, Roman Empire was on its peak, and because of that reason, these Guptas were benefited, traded along with these the gold coins with the Roman Empire. We have found, for example, let me tell you an example. In the South India, we have found lot of hoardings of gold coins of whom? Roman Empire. What it is telling you? It is telling that even we, Gupta's Empire and even the South India, have traded a lot with the Roman Empire. A lot with the Roman Empire. So this is about the Guptas. So this is about the coins and the kings. First punch-marked coins, and then image and names of the rulers was started minting. After that, gold coins by Kushanas. After that, gold, in that too, very purified gold and very spectacular gold. And now, by 500 AD, if you see, that towards the end of this ancient period, by 500 AD, you will see in the world history what was happening. The Western Roman Empire got collapsed. It got collapsed, and the impact of that you will see in the Indian region also. That most of the states, most of the regions in Indian subcontinent after 500 AD, they also lost their prosperity. They lost their prosperity. How can we know that? We can observe after 500 AD, the purity of gold got down, and even the size of the gold got down. So the purity of the gold and the size of the gold got down after 500 AD, even in the Gupta's coin itself. So what it is telling? It is telling that after 500 AD, because the Roman Empire got completely collapsed, the impact was spilled over even to the Gupta's Empire and even the states which are present in the Indian subcontinent at that period. So that is why this is an evidence that the quality of the gold got down, and even the size of the gold got down. Understand? So this is what the normally the coinage and the kings who issued them. First punch-marked coins, after that gold coins for the first time by Kushanas, after that the Guptas who issued the very spectacular gold coins, and after 500 AD even that gold coins now became less purified, and again we will see the rise of silver coins in the medieval India. After 600 AD you will see the rise of silver coins. This is what the coins and the issues. So why should one study about the coins? This is a very important question. So I have been telling you about which type of coins were issued and by whom, but why one should study the coins? Only the coins, the study of coins will tell you how the commercial networks were there in the society. Commercial network in the world, not even society, sir. For example, if a Gupta coin was found in the Mediterranean area or the Roman Empire, what it tells? It tells that Guptas were actually trading with them. If a Roman coin was found in the South India, what it is telling us? It is telling that there was a huge commercial network between Roman Empire and India. So for that reasons, to know the commercial importance of our subcontinent in the world, to know the economic participation of our ancient India in the world history, we have to know, we have to study about the coins. And another important fact about the coins is, for example, as I have said, on a coin, the name of the ruler and image of the ruler was started by Indo-Greeks by 200 BC. If so, that name, how can we, who should study that? Which language it was in, and which script it was in? Who should study that? They normally historians, just like archaeologists, there are some specialists who can study these coins, and they are called as the numismatists. Numismatists. So these numismatists, They are the people who study the script present on the coins, who study the images present on the coins, and who study even the context of issuance of coins. So these numismatists are very, very important, who helps in the history reconstruction. Now, so we have studied the coins and the kings. Now just a small concept. Almost we are ending with the urban economy. So how the inscriptions are actually deciphered? How the inscriptions are deciphered? Why? Because all this information that the towns were there, cities were there, urban population, artifacts, occupation, associations, trades within and beyond, all these things, how would we know, the modern historians and the modern people? We know only through the inscriptions. Yes or no? So only through inscriptions, by studying them, we know them. So normally how the inscriptions are actually deciphered? For example, inscriptions would contain Brahmi script, inscription would contain the Kharosti script. These are the two scripts which are used in the ancient period. So Brahmi script was mostly used in the Ashokan inscriptions, and Kharosti script was used in the northwestern subcontinent area. So how these scripts which were present in the inscriptions were actually deciphered? So one technique, for example, this Brahmi script. How Brahmi script was actually deciphered? It was deciphered by a technique called as working back from the modern language. Working back from modern language. What normally scholars would do?
Thank you. अथ श्री महाभारत कथा।